everyone. My name is Sarah Omar, and I'm an assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Ahmad Atif Ahmad, professor at UC Santa Barbara. You can find his full biography on this page. Dr. Ahmad, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Long time no see.
So I'd like to have you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your areas of research. It'd be nice just to get to know you a little bit better.
Well, so I grew up in Egypt. I think, as far as I can remember, in the summers of junior high school, I was as likely to pick up a book on science fiction as I was likely to read on religious history. So I don't think at that time I thought of my interests as related to the Muslim world or the Arabic speaking world or anything like that. But I'm from there, so that's inevitably had to be part of the story. When I wanted to decide to take a certain field to study in college, everybody in the family was appalled that that was going to be the stuff that we call literature, history, philosophy, etc. You had the grades for medicine, that's what you do. It's a better field. It deserves the good mind that you have, that sort of thing. And I think their arguments, because they were so bad, confirmed to me that I should just follow my intuition. So I did two things. One is studying Arabic and Islamic studies, and one is modern Egyptian law. And by the time my head was stuffed with these two courses of study, it was very hard to go back. The biggest tool, though, that I learned is to read old Arabic texts. And when I look back now, I think, well, anybody can read anything, of course, but will you understand deeply what you read? That depends. Of course, you have to meet the right kind of teachers, and you have to be open to wanting to figure things out as opposed to rush to criticize or relate them to your personal experience. I think the big blessing has been that if you read a text that is that old, you're not bound to classify it as philosophy or literature or medicine or law, because all these are recent classifications. So you feel that kind of freedom. On the other hand, it's tough, of course, because there's a lot you need to know to understand what's being said. So there was also a trip to Yemen that my family took when I was 14, stayed there 3 years. That must have played a role in getting me to realize, for example, that Islamic history is contested. If you live in a Zaydi Shia community, they don't see early Islamic history the same way. So all of this must have been in the background.
Okay. And, one question that I'm curious to hear you speak about more is this question about the types of questions you've asked. You've done a lot of research and you have a long and fruitful career of publishing, and you've really focused on Islamic law as in depth and so many different aspects of Islamic law. And so I'm curious to hear you sort of discuss the way in which your questions and your thinking has evolved over time and over this long career.
Very good. Yeah, I think only in the last week after you gave me these questions to think about, I started to realize there is a pattern, I think. In 2009, I published an article that came out in a collection called Islam, Modernity, Violence, and Everyday Life. It may have been chapter 4, Social Custom as a Source of Law in Islam. I think that question, in some form, came to me in the mid-'80s. What happens when societies have long traditions? They don't want to necessarily reject them, but they don't want to live by them. So they want to reconcile two things: the specific customs or social standards that they have established or maintained in recent history. Recent here would be like a century or two, and the longer history. And in this article, I talked to one of these dead friends, a man who lived in Damascus between 1784 and 1836. And he wrote a treatise, that's Ibn Abdin of Damascus. He wrote a treatise on how and whether you should reconcile these two traditions. Is very loyal to the tradition. He thinks, of course, it begins with revelation, so we can't just chuck it like this. But what happens when the social standards of a certain city or a certain group or a certain profession conflict with this established tradition, or what's the correct way of doing things morally and legally and socially and religiously? And he tries to come up with laws that govern that. The new tradition has to be long enough in terms of time duration, it has to be broad enough in terms of geographic application, but it also has to be reconcilable with the old tradition. So what I'm saying here is, when I sat down and maybe may have spent only 2 or 3 months to read this treatise on Urf and write my own reaction, which was actually longer than the original treatise, it was already, the subject has been sizzling my mind maybe for 20, 25 years. The Fatigue of the Sharia is a more known piece, longer, of course, it's a little booklet. That also is a question that started around maybe 93, 94 when I was reading Zarkeshi's text on it was a long kind of encyclopedia, cut and paste encyclopedia of Usul al-Fiqh. And one of the questions that caught my attention is this issue of the Fatigue of the Sharia. What does that mean? It means, when you think about it, is a bunch of scholars who see a system to be very dominant and very successful. That's about 1,000 years ago, sitting and wondering whether it will wither away, whether it will begin to be too weak to be maintained. Well, that invites them to ask, well, what is the essence of it? Is it reason? Well, that shouldn't wither away. If it is tradition in the sense of the Prophet's example, what the Prophet did, said, or tacitly approved of, as they defined Sunnah, then it may change, of course. If it is the madhab or the school of law that systematizes all these elements, it also has a chance of disappearing. So, yeah, it would take about 20. I'm not advising that people do that. This is a very slow way of being. I think you suffer from that too. You'd have a question in your head and you sit on it 15 years before you want to publish something on it. It's okay to publish faster, but be modest, of course, and say, well, this is the best I can do now. But I haven't been the most kind of pragmatic person who would approach a topic and say, look, here are the tools that I have to address it. I'm going to read that much. I'm going to keep talking to people and asking them what they think about it, and then write down what I have. And I'm trying to make it entertaining too, because it's very hard actually. People, don't pick up books now and read unless they're promised that the writing is entertaining. So you have to work on that at the very end. I didn't do that, which is probably why I'm taking a pause now as far as publication. That might go on for a while.
So, the question that I'd like to pose next is, given that Islamic law is sort of a long and established field, but it's also an evolving field and has seen some changes over time, how have you shifted and changed your approaches and methods to your own questions and your own research, given that the field is and has been evolving over time?
That's true, actually. So even the things, I hope I'm not misunderstood when I say I don't have a particular cause, that all the participants with causes alert you to something. When a female scholar says, well, you notice that Islamic law is really being affected constantly by the fact that the producers are either all male or mostly male. Does that mean anything? Well, they could be all medical doctors, for example, and medical doctors keep talking about females and they think they understand the female body and the psychology and so on. They have done that for the longest period, the longest part of modernity. So it's not exactly a strange thing to us, but at the same time, it demands a pause. Why should that be the case? What happens when I started to have a lot of female students here in California, graduate students, all adult and some more married and have thought about families and all these issues that Islamic law addresses. So what happens when these people begin to think differently about the marital contract, the marriage contract, about the role of women in the market, in adjudication, the justice system, and other elements of life? And so what happened was all this pushed me, of course, to realize that I haven't thought about a lot of things. And I'm still thinking. So I thought about the idea of crime and whether restitution or restoration or punishment for a very long time. But I'm not yet ready to say what I think about it in a writing form, because I started to see these manuscripts now. I'm pretty sure that the Ottoman world about 400 years ago was more eager not to punish criminals, but to go back to reestablish the peace that preceded the crime. Or even, it didn't have to be a crime. So, you know, in the Arabic term dhaman, that includes what we call contractual liability, tortious liability, and criminal liability. So if I break your door inadvertently and it's not considered a crime, it's considered just a civil matter. Or if I knock your computer down, and we're talking about compensation. All this, all these, what are three different categories in modern law, were addressed as one thing. And the point was to go back and reestablish the peace. I'm willing to say that now, based on information, based on what my studies so far, but I'm not sure what to do with it. How would I write about it? Do I recommend to the California criminal justice system that it stops imprisoning people? They need that. I mean, actually, recently the governor and the whole government of California actually decided to halt the juvenile justice system because they realized it's not working. It's not really rehabilitating anybody. It's just creating criminals. But of course, if you were to suggest to people that we should imprison less people, well, you need to explain the alternative. What is the alternative? So I think this is going to sit and sizzle in my head maybe for the next 10 years. If I'm still alive, I might be writing something about it. So back to the initial point. Yes, the contribution of all these, what may be called marginal voices, voices that used to not be heard. I have been really exposed mostly to female scholars recently. That the field is becoming very attractive to female scholars. Some, of course, are like you, or even older and more advanced in their career. And a lot of them are being trained now. And I'd say, in 20, 30 years, probably it'll be mostly females. But also, they can do better than us. They can think differently about all these issues that we haven't thought about enough, given that we were thrown into the world in this particular time, right? As Heidegger would say, we're all thrown into the world. We don't necessarily make it our own. It makes us, it shapes us and makes us who we are. So yeah, I'm thinking more opportunity rather than problems here.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Ahmed. It's been such a pleasure hearing you discuss your work and some of your thinking. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the opportunity.
Here.